for Byzantine Studies. I welcome you all to this lecture, which is part of the GABAM lecture series. And it's a great pleasure to have this evening Nicholas Melvani, who is well known in our Istanbul community as our speaker today. And today is one of the winter-spring lectures, which are this academic year dedicated to new perspectives on Byzantine material culture and heritage. So thank you very much, Nicholas, for accepting our invitation. And I also want to thank Anamet for hosting us again this evening. So our next lecture will again be in this auditorium on Monday, 6th of April, by Şeniz Atik, who will present new glass finds in Istanbul. So it will certainly be an interesting event. I now give the word to our Vice Director, Ivana Jeftic, to introduce our speaker.
So, good evening, everyone. And these are not empty words when I'm going to say that I am very happy to have Dr. Nicholas Melvani with us today. I'm very grateful that he accepted the invitation, and I'm also very happy that we have such a lovely audience for his lecture this evening. So, as Inge Hoca already said, Nicholas Melvani is well known in our Istanbul circle. He is currently a researcher in Mainz, University Johannes Gutenberg, and he previously held very important fellowships, among them the fellowship of GABAM, the fellowship, he was also Anamed fellow, and also he held fellowships like the one from the Hellenistic Studies Center at Princeton University. Nicola Melvani is also someone I know since very long time. I think we met when we were both doing our PhDs. You are probably familiar with his extraordinary work on late Byzantine sculpture and related monograph. But Nicholas has also worked a lot on epigraphy, on monasteries and monasticism, particularly in the late Byzantine period. And he had also worked a lot on the topography of late Byzantine Constantinople. So when his book, I think Politics, Conflicts, what was the title? Politics, Conflicts and Monasteries in 15th Century Constantinople appeared. I think it was in September 2025. It was like the greatest event waiting that many of us were waiting. And I was very happy that Nicholas accepted to come and to give us a talk that would touch upon some of the aspects that he had developed in his book. So I'm inviting him to share these insights with us and looking forward to his talk, The Monastic Topography of 15th Century Constantinople, an interdisciplinary approach to the Byzantine legacy of Istanbul. So, Nicholas, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction. I just want to make sure that the microphone is working. You can hear me, okay. As Ivana said, I'm also very happy to be here at Anamed. I have presented in this room several times, and actually the first time was almost 12 years ago when I was a fellow at Anamed, and during one of the mini symposia that we used to organize back then. It was called the RCAC, but it doesn't matter. It's the same thing. I was the first speaker in one of those symposia, and the title was almost the same as today. Because I was working on this project as a fellow, I had actually just started working on it. And it is also appropriate that I'm here for an event organized by GABAM because I continued this project. I actually expanded it in 2015 to 17 with a project on late Byzantine, not just 15th century, but late Byzantine monasteries. This is a screenshot from the GABAM website. And then after several years, all this resulted in a monograph, which came out in September, as Ivana said. So we thought that it would be a nice idea to return to the crime scene, as we might say, to revisit some of the things I have been researching all these years at Koç University during my various fellowships, and share some of my ideas. Obviously, this is not a book presentation, or I'm not going to summarize what is in the book, but I will present some of the aspects and focus on some of the ideas, and try to demonstrate, first of all, why this topic is important. Why is it worth doing research on it? Obviously, by mentioning the legacy of Istanbul, I believe that it is important for it's relevant to all of us who are working on the urban physiognomy of Istanbul through the ages. And another question is, I would like to propose, which I already did with the book, but I would also like to propose some methods of approaching these problems. Monastic space within an urban landscape. I'd like to demonstrate that there are specific ways of approaching religious sites and sacred space in general within a mega city such as Istanbul, but we need to be cautious of some challenges. So the best way to begin is by setting the stage with a brief survey of Constantinople during its final decades, and introduce the main actors of our story. As you can see, I have some very basic events in the history of Constantinople during these last years. It's basically the reigns of the three last Paleologan emperors. And the period is defined by it begins with the first Ottoman blockade in the end of the 14th century, which lasted 8 years, and of course the period ends with the conquest of Constantinople. This is basically the last phase, when the Byzantine emperors, the aristocracy, and the rest of the population made their final attempt to reorganize the city, maintain balance between the Ottomans and the Italian maritime republics, who were the dominant forces of the time, and benefit from the economic activity of the Genoese settlement of Pera. So why is this period important? I want to demonstrate that this is a distinct period in the history of the city. It's commonly periodized as part of the Paleologan period, obviously, but it has some distinct features because of the devastating effects of the siege, the 1394 siege, and because of the new reality that emerged afterwards, since there was very little left of the Byzantine Empire after 1402, the end of the siege, which has prompted scholars such as Jonathan Harris to say that this was basically a city-state, the city-state of Constantinople. And so by focusing on this last phase, we get the chance to highlight, have a snapshot of the final, the end of the development of the city just before the transition to the Ottoman period, which I think we all agree resulted in the radical transformation of the city. So if we want to take a quick look at the city during the 15th century, the best way is the text of one of the travelers who visited Constantinople in the early 15th century, the Spanish traveler Clavijo, who basically, in a few words, captures the main features. That it was great, the city, but it was not very densely populated, and that inside you could see orchards, fields, and hamlets and suburbs. So he describes like an agglomeration of settlements surrounded by gardens and fields. And the main center, or the most populated part, was the northern coast, so the coast of the Golden Horn, and where there was a lot of commercial activity centered around the gates. He says that there are palaces, churches, and monasteries, but they are in ruins. So this is a picture we get from other sources that a great part of the city's infrastructure, its late antique heritage, was basically in ruins. But it was still admired, as we can see. Clavijo, for example, says it used to be one of the noblest capitals of the world. And this picture is also captured in the panoramic views of Constantinople, which are transmitted in the various manuscripts with the text of the Italian humanist Cristoforo Buondelmonti. He visited the city slightly later, and his text was circulated in several copies, and each copy received a variation of this illustration, this panoramic view. Some of them are very similar, others have differences. But the dominant features are, of course, the Hagia Sophia. The Hippodrome appears very often. The antique columns, which obviously impressed visitors. The proximity to Pera, which was a major commercial center, and otherwise the fortification walls and some monasteries dispersed around what would mostly be seen as empty space. I also wanted to say a few things about the available evidence. It's important for the methodology. Now, we already saw that there are a lot of texts, so I already showed you one travel account, but there's also archival evidence and historiography and chronicles and several types of written sources. There are the visual sources, like these let's call them maps. But there's also some archaeological or material evidence, but it's highly problematic. For example, we do have remains of monasteries, mostly churches, converted into mosques, but they are detached from anything that would imply that they were once part of a monastery. In some cases, we don't even know their original names. For example, the Vefa Kilise Jami, there is some disagreement whether to which monastery it belonged, but this is probably the most plausible identification so far, the Virgin Vevea Serpidos. So there is also evidence on the ground, but it needs a combination of different evidence to make sense of it, which is why I included the word interdisciplinary in today's title. And of course, we need to keep in mind that a monastery is a place where someone wants to withdraw and remain isolated. these are examples of famous monasteries which are situated outside of urban centers. Of course, Istanbul and Constantinople are different. For example, in Istanbul, we have a very complicated urban framework, so we need to actually dig deep into various types of sources to understand what went on. So this is a general map of monasteries active in the 15th century. Most of them were older foundations, so they are known to Byzantinists who have worked with Byzantine material. Studios Monastery, the Mangana from the Middle Byzantine period, the famous Pantokrator, the Pamakaristos, the Hora. So well-known historic monasteries were still in existence, but there were some new ones in the 15th century. So it is time to introduce some of these. So when we follow the main events of public life, religious and public life in Byzantine Constantinople during its final decades, we do come across monks, prominent figures in the ecclesiastical events of the time. And what is very characteristic is that in the late 15th and late 14th and early 15th, patriarchs, so the leaders of the Church of Constantinople, tended to come from monasteries. So I have three examples here. One of them, of course, from the famous Studios, but these two people are from monasteries which rose to prominence in the late 14th century. So they are relatively new foundations, which shows that there's a dynamic monastic movement in the during this period we are discussing. Even though the city is conceived as being in decline, there are even new monastic foundations. And slightly later, during the reign of Manuel Paleologos, he was his major effort in reorganizing the city after the end of the Ottoman blockade was included monks. He was in frequent contact with the monks of several monasteries, and we know from the sources that he actually visited monastic communities, interacted with the monks, and I have 4 examples here, which show the emperor being present in these monasteries in various places in the city. And of course, from the historiographical point of view, the main events, religious events, always involved monks from the monasteries of Constantinople. So I have 2 examples of very famous figures who took part in the most crucial problem of the 15th century, so negotiating with the Church of Rome. So the Emperor Manuel II and his successor John VIII involved the monks in the discussions, and even when it was time for the Council of Florence and the union was initially signed, some abbots of monasteries actually co-signed the union. This, of course, changed. After the union, there were different parties, let's say, in favor and against the union, and most of these disputes went on in the monasteries, with the active participation of their abbots or other prominent monks. So by looking at the events and looking at the participation of monks in their interaction with the emperor and their involvement with the patriarchate, it becomes clear that monasteries were very important for the religious policy, but because religious policy was important within the wider framework of the political developments, monasteries were also important for other. They influenced other aspects of imperial and ecclesiastical politics. But now it is time to zoom in on the monasteries and see what actually went on inside the monasteries. So as we already said, a monastery is a place that is supposed to be for people who withdraw from worldly life and focus mostly on prayer. And the 14th century was a time when there's a great rise in a return to the spiritual tradition and heritage of the early ages of monasticism, mostly on Mount Athos, the most important monastic center of the time. And monks from Athos actually proposed more rigorous ways of monasticism, withdrawal from the world, and continuous prayer and so on. So some of these monks actually settled in Constantinople and influenced the course of monasticism in Constantinople as well. I have one example. These two brothers, Ignatios and Kallistos Xanthopoulos, they were the founders of the monastery of the Xanthopouli. It came up earlier. And they wrote a manual for monks for how to practice hesychastic prayer. Hesychasm was the practice of withdrawing and pursuing the life of a hermit, practically. So this manual was very influential for the development of monastic life in Constantinople, but also throughout the Balkans. But this did not mean that the character of monastic life changed radically, because the life of secluded monks had to be combined with the cenobitic life, which meant living as a community. And for example, for the monastic rule, the typikon drawn for the monastery of Charsianitis, another one of these new foundations, it is clearly stated that living together is the essence of monastic life. So even though it was expected that you were supposed to withdraw and dedicate time to prayer, communal life was also important. So this meant common life centered around the main church, where the monks would attend Mass, and there was a balance between the communal life in the church and the private life of the monks, which entailed the praying and the focus on contemplation. So there's a new wave of rigorous ascetic practices in Constantinopolitan monasteries, combined with the tradition of communal life. But there's a lot more going on inside the monasteries. For example, there are, as in previous periods as well, but there's a very active center for the copying and even decoration of manuscripts in the historic monastery of the Oliyi. So we do have manuscripts dated to this period, and some of them decorated. So this one is actually signed by a scribe with a date, and also interesting are the biomorphic initials, so very lively decoration. So this was the monastery of the Oliyi. Another famous monastery, the monastery of Petra, had also a scribal center or a copying center for the production of manuscripts, but there is also a small workshop for binding of manuscripts. So and they produced very characteristic types of Byzantine book covers, like this one, which is characteristic of this workshop in this monastery. And in addition to copying new books, there were also extensive libraries. For example, one of the most famous Byzantine illustrated manuscripts, the Vienna Dioscoridis, late 5th century manuscript, known also from its first owner, Juliana Anicia, the founder of the monastery of St. Polyeuctus, for example. So one of the most famous scientific manuscripts and illustrated manuscripts was in the library of Petra in the 15th century, where it was actually used, copied, and consulted on a regular basis. This photo is very characteristic because it has the original text, the late 5th century text, and notes by the 15th century user who actually transcribed the earlier text to make it more accessible to contemporary readers. And other manuscripts produced in the Petra monastery included scientific treatises with decoration. And these are dated, so these paint a very lively picture of scholarly activity and artistic activity, and so a scientific text being copied and reproduced, and figural decoration with interest in displaying interest in the human body. It is very reminiscent of, humanist practices known from other parts of the Mediterranean. And we do know that the monasteries, especially the Petra monastery, attracted visitors, scholars from early Renaissance Italy. So thanks to manuscripts, libraries, and the theological works, we know that we can place the monasteries of Constantinople within a very wide network of foundations and developments going on elsewhere in the late medieval world. For example, the monasteries were well connected with the Balkans. These hesychastic monks were very well connected with the Balkans, even with the early stages of monasticism in Russia. And the scholarly work was related to humanist developments in Italy. So by now, I think we have established that the monasteries were not just about monks and nuns praying in their monasteries, but we have seen emperors and scholars and various people interacting and present in the monasteries. But there's more to that. We can trace more people from outside of the monasteries interacting with the monastic communities. So as was the case also in earlier times, especially in the early Paleologan period, members of various social groups, especially from the Paleologan elites, actively supported monastic foundations as patrons. So basically, what we see is patrons from the Palaiologos family, the imperial family, and their various branches and their networks were and continued to endow monasteries with land and donations in money. So the methods are various. They range from financial support, donations in land, income, sponsoring building activity, donating icons, liturgical vessels, and perhaps the most characteristic type is the construction and configuration of funerary spaces. So chapels and annexes like narthexes to existing churches, and the decoration. A well-known example is the Hora Monastery, which already had tombs and portraits, funerary portraits from the time of its renovation by Metohites in the 14th century. But some of the tombs in the outer narthex can be dated to the 15th century. This is a general view looking north, and a general view of one of these tombs with fragments of the original decoration. And what is probably characteristic is these monograms of families, different families. So they show that these people were the products of intermarriages and were consciously displaying their affiliations to several wealthy and powerful families within these funerary spaces inside the monasteries. And another tomb here with signs of early Renaissance perspective in the rendering of the human figure. So in general, these lay aristocratic patrons created their small private spaces within monasteries, where they used inscriptions, images, emblems to display their aristocratic identity. So there's a lot of social action going on in the monasteries. Another example is the Petra Monastery, about which we know from the sources mostly. We know that there was a funerary chapel outside the main church, which Neslihan Asutay Effenberger has identified as the Kasıma Jami, a small mosque, which is now drastically refigured, but in older photos, it seems that there were tombs in the west wall. And so Asutay Effenberger has connected this small mosque with the nearby Odalar Jami and has identified them as parts of the Petra Monastery about we have already heard so much. And she also added this cistern into the discussion, and I will return to the cisterns later. Although the presence of the elites was overwhelming and is overwhelming in the textual, visual, and spatial record, underprivileged social groups of late Paleologan Constantinople were also involved within the physical space of the monasteries, mostly during celebrations or litanies and other publicly attended processions. Her characteristic examples are the litanies and the weekly processions of the Odigitria icon around the historic monastery of the Odigi. I will return to that later as well. And there is a very indicative example, the monastery or the shrine of Saint Theodosia, where large crowds gathered twice a week to venerate the relics of the popular saint. And there's a famous episode from the narrative of the conquest, because the 29th of May, the day of the conquest, was the feast day of the saint. And the historian Dukas says that on that day there were several people in the shrine, which was part of the monastery of Christ Evergetis. So it was the area around what is now the Gül Cami, but its identification is still elusive, but at least that's the general area. And in addition to this ceremonial action, there were these charitable services offered by monasteries, which had a great impact on the broader populations. For example, the Typikon, the charter for the monastery of Khaçanitis, explicitly states that there was supposed to be a distribution to the poor on specific days. So now it is. We already looked at who was present, who interacted with the monasteries. Now it's time to look at the topography and the spatial aspect. In general, based on what we know from the sources and from monastic centers elsewhere, a monastery is basically, it's not one building, it's a building complex consisting of several components. These are the standard parts one would expect in a monastery. So a church for the communal services, a refectory for the common meals, a place where the monks would live and concentrate on their prayers, and probably also offices and even storage spaces, somewhere to store food or clothes. And the refectory would have to have a kitchen, obviously. Now, for the Petra monastery, we already probably realized that there's more involved, because we read about a library, copying manuscripts, binding manuscripts, which is almost industrial activity. There was a hospital and even a school, which used the library and attracted the scholars we mentioned from Italy. But of course, there is very little of all these in the archaeological record in Constantinople and Istanbul. In most cases, we basically have a detached church, most often in use as a mosque, but anything surrounding it from its phase as a monastic church has disappeared. Some exceptions, well, we could say that the Pantokrator, because it's a cluster of more than one church and it includes some additional spaces, some parts of it we do have an idea how it worked as a whole, but still it's a small part of what we know about the monastery from the sources, which also had a hospital from earlier centuries. And since we already brought up the Petra monastery, all we have is ruins, and the best we have is older photos which show at least what it used to be. If this is the correct identification, we really have very little about the Petra monastery. So what we can do is combine different types of evidence on the site. What, for example, Neslihan Asutay Effenberger has done with these buildings, the Kasım-Ağa Mescidi and the Odalar Cami. And because we need more buildings, even this building here, the Kefeli, now known as the Kefeli Cami, has been connected with the wider area of the monastery. It may have been the refectory, for example. And as I already said, the existence of nearby cisterns is also important because the monasteries, we know that used cisterns for their water supply. The İpek Bodrum cistern is now covered by a playground, but we know it from older photos. It was most likely used by the monastery for its needs. And again, this old photo from the German Archaeological Institute with the Kasıma Mosque and the odalar in the background. And another example which I have suggested might belong to a monastery close to the Yavuz Sultan Selim complex, so the Philanthropos Monastery, the Sultan's cistern, which is now used as a restaurant. It has this dense network of columns, and this is what it looks like outside. And a similar work has been done by Robert Osterhout with the Kora Monastery. He does see these retaining walls here as the limits here, and he can place the gate here, the refectory somewhere here, I think. So we need to look at things like retaining walls, nearby cisterns, and so on to combine this evidence. And we know that several cisterns were still in use in the 15th century, and many of them were connected with monasteries. So it's reliable evidence. And we do have some visual evidence as well, although it's tricky. So this is a later representation of the monastery of the Pamakaristos from the 16th century phase, when it was visited by German scholars. They did provide a general plan and image of the monastery with its surrounding wall and its courtyards. This is an image of the famous scholar John Argyropoulos teaching inside the school of the Petra Monastery. So it could be the background might be conceived as a reference to the buildings of the monastery. And of course, the Buondelmonti maps are also useful because they give us a very generic type, of course, but they show a church surrounded by an enclosure. They consistently depict monasteries in this way, so they give us a good idea. Now, I think we're running out of time, but since we're trying to present a broader picture, some insights about the economic activity, which also help us realize how the monasteries were present in the life of the city, especially during the, for example, I'd say during the blockade of the 14th century, late 14th century, we have monasteries converting their properties into vineyards or fields to make them profitable and produce a profit. I have produced this map showing some monastic properties that can be identified from the sources in the city. And what is new is that, as you can see, one of the patrons of the monastery of St. Nicholas in Constantinople actually endowed his monastery with funds in the Bank of St. George in Genoa. So even proto-capitalist activities were affected the monasteries. Okay, I wanted to return to Clavijo's description, who actually says that Pera is so close and that it's an organic part of the city, the economic life of the city. So with monasteries having property close to the shores, they were actually engaged in economic activity with the Italians of Pera. And David Hendricks has provided me with this nice photo. We know from the sources that the monasteries had property in these areas, so it was right across the Gulf from Pera. And if we, of course, it's difficult to visualize how these orchards and gardens worked in these urban monasteries. Older pictures sometimes help with, for example, which show gardens and fields around the monasteries even in the 20th century. So let's look at the broader picture and how look at the imprint of the monasteries on the cityscape and the urban topography. So if we look at how they interacted with their urban surroundings, well, they were dispersed in various parts of the city, but especially those that are close to the fortifications. For example, the monastery of Christ Everietis, which included the shrine of Saint Theodosia. And because of this monastic complex, which was roughly in the area of what we now call the Ayakapı, it actually gave the name to the gate, Hagia Theodosia, Hagia Gate, and this name was preserved in Ottoman times. Again, I repeat, this is the area where the Gül Cami is. We're not sure whether it was connected, but it's the general area. And a similar smaller gate is in the Marmara seawalls, where close to where the monastery of the Oliyi was located, and also gave its name to the gate. And what actually helps us see how monasteries interacted with the urban fabric is the movement inside the city. By the 15th century, Constantinople was regarded as a sacred city with relics and venerable shrines. So pilgrims and visitors would visit the monasteries and venerate relics and icons. There were litanies attended by large crowds around the monastery of the Oliyi over here. We know it from depictions in art. This is the icon, a reproduction of the icon, of course. And we also know about litanies that took the icon from the Odigon up to the Hora, and from there the icon was processioned around the walls, especially during the siege and even the final siege of Constantinople. So this triptych, the monasteries, the icon, and the walls, this was animated by the ceremonial movement of the procession. And this reality continued to define memories of the city even after the Ottoman conquest. So images of the city, of the siege of the city, include the procession of icons and around the walls. So these are an imprint of these final events in the city. This is how the urban physiognomy of the monasteries managed to influence the memories in this multi-layered city, even after the fall of Constantinople. These are my ideas and what I wish to share with you. So hopefully there will be some discussion and we can expand more on these ideas. Thank you. Shall we move to the, okay.
So, thank you, Nicola. It was illuminating and it's extraordinary how you put all these different threads together. Many of us have been working on them separately, individually, but it is extraordinary how you put them together. Any questions from the audience? I see many hands.
I want an Egyptian.
Yes.
Thank you for presentation. Actually, I was interested in the first one or two slides. The agreement of Florence in 1439 about the union of the churches. It was signed officially, but it was never came into effect. Do you have any information or opinion about this situation? I mean, practically rejection of this agreement by the monks and monasteries in Constantinople. Yes, some of them supported, some of them not, but total rejection. At the end of the day, it was not practically implemented and applied. So was this because of the churches and monasteries in Constantinople in 15th century? Thank you.
Is this working? It is.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, it's an interesting story. In older bibliography, you would find statements like this, that the union failed because of the reaction, the negative reaction of the monasteries, and specifically the monks and nuns as well. I did indicate that the reality was more complicated, and especially the decade between 1440 and 1450 was characterized by disagreements and disputes. So it seems that it was not that straightforward that the monks were against the union. Some monasteries were in favor. It's possible that they were acting as allies of the emperor, because the main pattern we have is that the emperor wanted to enforce the union, and the church and the monasteries were against it. But whether we could say that it's because of the monks and monasteries that it failed, that would be difficult to say. The reason that the sources that modern scholarship tended to believe this is that because the faction that rose as the most powerful one in the end was the one that rejected the union. That's the reason why the voices that were in favor are not so often mentioned in bibliography. And specifically the faction led by Gennadios Scholarios, who became patriarch after the Ottoman conquest, he and his allies did a very systematic pursued a very systematic policy of rejecting the union. So it's basically because of what happened afterwards that we get this sense that monasteries were against the union. In reality, if we look at the sources, it's not always that clear. The truth is that there was a lot of discontent and very strong reactions, especially towards the end of, so just before the Ottoman siege. It seems that there was a lot of unrest in the city because of these disputes. But it's more complicated than that. It's also social. Sometimes it appears that the larger masses were against imperial policy. So there are other factors we need to weigh in.
was really interesting. And I'm personally really interested in the non-Greek, non-Orthodox religious spaces of Constantinople, and throughout your presentation you mentioned Pera and Genoese multiple times. So I was just wondering if you had anything to add about monasteries of Catholic community in Constantinople, particularly the Dominican order of the Genoese, and how they fit into the urban landscape of that late period of the city, and how would you like compare them to the Greek Orthodox monasteries of Byzantines? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for bringing this up. I was planning to mention the mendicant orders of Pera, but then I thought it was too much. But it's related to the question of the union as well, because the monasteries, these missions were, their main objective was to proselytize, or one of their objectives was to enforce the union and promote the rapprochement between the churches of Rome and Constantinople. And the Dominican order, which you mentioned, also included Greek converts. Greek scholars and theologians who were translating Thomas Aquinas and into Greek and adapting the Latin Mass to Greek. So there was a lot of activity in that direction. So the economic activity which I described was also followed by by religious dialogue, let's say, between these communities. It was primarily the Dominicans, the Franciscans were less active in this process. But there was the Dominicans were also present in these negotiations. They also interacted with the emperor. They are part of the landscape, yes.
Thank you very much. I'm an honorary fellow. I have many questions actually, but yeah, I'm choosing one of them. So I noticed in your manuscript that you mapped some road networks connecting to the monasteries. That was the second slide. So
You mean one of the panoramic views which
yeah,
has
with roads.
streets? Yes,
Yeah.
you're right.
So I find the visibility actually of these routes very vulnerable, because in my own research, for example, on the early Christian period, I had to excavate to reach actually for these routes to find and then to integrate the study. So were you able to reach movement patterns or integration values between monasteries from these routes, or are they those just paths partly hypothetical?
Yes, it's complicated. I was planning to say a few things about the street network as well, because the topography of Constantinople in the 15th century was very different from the late antique image we have of the city with its imperial fora and porticoed streets and all that. So throughout the Middle Ages, this urban network had been transformed, including the street network. So, as you said, one is tempted to use these patterns as indications of a, let's say, road system. And I think that what one could say is that at least those that lead to gates reflect to some extent actual pathways. There are several reasons one could say that. We know that there's a lot of activity around the gates, shops, money changing tables and so on. And so I think it's intentional when in these maps a road is shown leading into a gate. And it agrees with what we know from the sources as well. Otherwise, when we move toward the center of the city, it gets more complicated because there were these large monastic foundations with irregular perimeters, and so we're definitely we have moved away from the grid lines of the late antique infrastructure. So I think that when we move toward the center, they are less reliable, these patterns, but they do reflect the general layout, let's say, that they were winding and probably they followed the terrain of the hills and the enclosures of the monasteries. So I think they're closer to reality. The ones that are closer to the shore, especially the Golden Horn shore, they reflect. I think and I think that I'm not the Ottoman expert, but if we look at the Ottoman sources, we could find analogies, and so the gates are very crucial in this respect. Yeah.
Hi, Nicholas. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question. I might not have been able to get it correctly, but when you presented the evidence at the beginning of your presentation, I understood that your point was that in the 15th century, in this late period, despite all the things that have happened at the turn of the century, still there was ongoing monastic activity in the town. But I wasn't really able to get your point on the way of monasticism. How did it, I understand that there were scriptoria, there were, binding, copying and everything, so that shows really scholars being there, libraries still used and copied in scriptoria and everything. But how did it change with regards to the monasticism itself when you presented several tipika, and I wasn't able to understand what differentiated from before. Thank you.
Yes, if we want to look for change, there's not much, because it's basically a revival of older forms of monasticism already existing, and Constantinople was the center of, the mystical tradition since earlier times, and great monastic figures such as Theodore Stylites and or Simeon, the new theologian in the 10th century. So what we have is basically a new wave of older traditions, and it has been pointed out, as you said, that there's nothing new about this. These are very old monastic practices, this devotion to prayer, and the hesychastic tradition, which was so strong in the 14th century, was basically a revival of older traditions. So what we can see in Constantinople is the arrival of new communities. So two of the monasteries which were most present in the religious developments were new foundations. And even the older foundations, such as the Studios and the Hora, they had monks who settled after the blockade and revived their monasteries, bringing with them this new dynamism of Balkan monasticism, let's say, which started from Athos with influences from Sinai and the region of Palestine, which is even today still the birthplace of monasticism, Christian monasticism at least. So it's basically a story of renewal, not radical change or any revolution in monastic organization, but new waves of monastic traditions.
I guess I have some kind of roughly related questions. How many monasteries were founded that we know of, like refounded or revived, and do you have some estimate of how many monasteries were in the city, and hypothetically, what percentage of the city would this be? I can imagine it was quite high percent of the population, as the population is declining in monasteries. I don't know if that's the question that makes sense as well.
Well, there do appear some new foundations. Two of them, which I also mentioned, were very present in the sources. But there's more. Even some are small communities. It's difficult to count them as monasteries, but sometimes you get 4 or 5 cells inhabited by 2 or 3 monks, and they call it a small monastery, let's say. So it's hard to give an exact number, but more or less, if we agree on a definition of a monastery, 50 monasteries were active in the 15th century. Most of them older foundations, but a few of them were new. And it's sometimes difficult to say whether one monastery was refounded or whether there was continuity. Sometimes it's unclear in the sources whether it was actually abandoned in the meantime or whether a new patron just came in and offered some money, and which gave new life to the monastery. So regarding the population, well, the estimates are very pessimistic. In the bibliography, 40,000 inhabitants, but how many of them were monks or nuns? It's hard to say. So traditionally, a monastery like Studios, with its spacious basilica, would mean even hundreds of monks in older times. In Middle Byzantine times, so the Pantocrator, I think in the Typicon it says 50 monks. So that's closer to the late Paleologan reality. But I think that in practice they were even smaller, these communities. So the Vevea Serpidos Typicon, I think it mentions 24 nuns, and maybe in the 15th century there were even smaller communities. So, but there's also in the sources sometimes there's these groups of people generically referred to as monks and nuns in various parts of the city, even along the walls. So you don't know what that means. It could be just someone who is devoted to prayer, and like a widower who is withdrawn from secular life. So yeah, it could be more complicated than that. Yeah.
And one more question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Melvani. And my question is connected with the previous one. So when one works with literature devoted to the Byzantine Constantinople in its last decades, one can get an impression that there were nothing except of the monasteries. And if we look at the bounded Monte map, we can see the same picture, the devastated city with oases, several oases of these monasteries. And I always recall the anti-monastic discourse of Plato in the same period, who prevented his senior from protecting, from supporting the monasteries. So my question is, what is your opinion, position of this process of monastic predominance in the last decades of Byzantine city, and and its decline to the Ottoman rule. So it is more historiosophically a question, but it has to be answered if we want to understand the sense of this process.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understood, but let me try and follow your rationale. So it's we do find in the literature this picture of a declining city which was mostly occupied by monasteries and fields. Is this what you're referring to? Yeah. So whether that has anything to do with the general cultural climate, you mean, and whether it's related to the general decline of Constantinople?
General decline, but at the same time, the growth of monastic predominance, as we can judge by some sources.
Yes, that's true.
Or it is the problem of extant sources that we have.
Okay, whether it's misleading. Well, the sources, the monasteries do appear in the sources very consistently. It doesn't mean that the monks were the only actors involved. But in terms of the involvement of the patriarchate, for example, in religious and political affairs, there is a link between monasteries and general events. So I'm also not entirely okay with this idea of decline. It was certainly not the great city it used to be, but there was some stability and some wealth in some cases, especially thanks to Pera and the commercial activity. But I don't like the word decline. I think it's a different world. And monks and monasteries were active in different ways. So several of these monks were, as we saw, open to humanist influences. And even though Platon is, of course, hostile towards this tradition, it's not a black and white. It's not monks versus the rest of the world. I think that we should adopt a more nuanced approach. Monks were also involved in secular matters, so I wouldn't give a straightforward reply. But I mean, you do get this sense that sometimes they are accused, the monks, they are accused of facilitating the Ottoman capture. It is present in some, even in some sources. But there are other monks who were against the Ottomans. It's people change sides, and it's more political than that.
Thank you, Nicholas. I have a question about the how you identify certain monasteries with their pro-unionist or anti-unionist position. I guess you base that position mainly on what we know about its abbot, right? Or do we have a more general, I mean, do the sources, or do you have sources that talk in more general terms about the monastery at large, including the monks? Or is it mainly the abbots?
Yes, it's true. It's basically, it's based on one person's actions or a text written by an abbot or whether he signs the Declaration of the Union. It's basic. It's very. It's centered on people, not on individual personalities, not on the entire community. There's nowhere I haven't found any reference to like Studite monks as being a body of a coherent body, like they were in the times of the iconoclastic controversy. The only case I could argue that there might be some consistence is the Petra Monastery. I find so many people from the Petra Monastery in favor of the union. I tend to think that there's a concentration of like-minded patrons and monks there, but it definitely does not preclude that there were others who were against the union. So I think that's a case-to-case.
Thank you. I was just curious to see whether there was any source identifying the whole community or at least a large number.
No, it doesn't appear anywhere. No.
Thank you.
No.
But it would have been interesting to imagine of the interior life of a monastery with monks maybe thinking
Fighting
different.
each other,
I can imagine in the refectory
attacking
during
with
a kind of-
icons and.
Very vibrant. Okay. Well, I think this was really very good discussion. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nicolas, so much. And we can continue with the informal discussions in the lobby with a nice buffet where everybody is welcome. Thank you, Nicolas.
Thank you.